Here we are, part 10, the recursive radicalism of Nick Fuentes, accusations, origin, and the forbidden exception. On reputational myth, ideological initiation, and the lone unbreakable rule of American conservatism. The first thing a dissident must do is deny the crimes he never committed. Every political awakening begins not with a belief, but with the discovery of the one topic no one is allowed to question. Reputation is the raft on which the young ideologue drifts into the storm. Accusation is the wave that baptizes him into history. The accusatory theater. On disavowal, ritual clearance, and the political necessity of denial. Every controversial figure begins his public existence by performing a liturgy of negation, for the audience will not hear who he is until he first proclaims who he is not. And this ritual, however absurd, becomes the toll required to enter the arena of discourse without being immediately devoured by caricatures. You guys got to ask better questions. Seriously, you just say hi, hello, and you ask, what am I reading, when it says right there in the title. It's really just... The demand, do you hate this group? Do you want violence? Are you an agent of the state? Is not a request for information, but a purification rite. An exorcism that must be performed before discussion can proceed, revealing that in the digital age, innocence must be repeatedly reasserted, because accusation is presumed to be the natural form of truth. To deny outlandish charges publicly, even those no rational observer believed, demonstrates how algorithmic rumor has replaced evidence. Reputations are now constructed not from deeds, but from the velocity of slander. The rapid-fire clearing of charges functions as theatrical sacrament in which both host and guest agree to suspend the world's distortions long enough to speak in human terms, as if stepping out of the digital coliseum to catch breath before re-entering combat. It doesn't matter. Everybody on here is kind of bots. I'm doing it for myself. Hi, hello, what are you reading? Over and over again. The disavowal of conspiracies, whether about crimes, hatred, or the murder of rivals, is not merely factual correction, but a metaphysical gesture, a reclaiming of narrative sovereignty in a landscape where identity is shaped by hostile spectators rather than by one's own voice. Those who enter the public sphere without performing this ritual become sacrifices to the tribal appetite. The crowd does not seek truth but confirmation that is suspicious. The necessity of these clarifications reveal that misinterpretation has become a weapon deployed at industrial scale, and one must now defend against falsehood before one may assert any positive belief. Accusation is cheap, but refutation is labor. Thus the accuser holds asymmetrical power, for he spends only a word to create a burden that can consume entire futures. The host's insistence on point-by-point fairness. To publicly clear a guest of false charges is to commit a small defiance against the ambient hostility of the age, where silence is safer than accuracy and correction is interpreted as complicity. The refusal to join the dog pile is a political act. It rejects the moral economy in which betrayal is expected. Loyalty is punished, and neutrality is considered evidence of guilt. Thus, the accusatory theater is both threshold and trial. Only those who endure its humiliations may speak, and only those who repeatedly survive it may build anything resembling a movement. Reputational initiation on slander, mischaracterization, and the myth of the young dissident. Every young dissident is born in scandal, for the culture will not permit a clean beginning. Instead, he must be forged through the furnace of misrepresentation, which teaches him early that truth matters less than narrative control. The persona, pro-rape villain, genocidal extremist, agent provocateur, or any other grotesque exaggeration is not constructed to reflect reality, but to inoculate the public against ever hearing the dissident's claim on their own terms. Slander becomes a form of preemptive censorship by defining the man before the message appears. Institutions ensure that only the caricature is debated, while the substantive critique remains untouched. The repeated experience of being mischaracterized generates a strange kind of clarity. The dissident learns that his reputation is not an extension of his actions, but a battlefield occupied by hostile storytellers. The mischaracterization is not accidental, but preservative. It protects ideological orthodoxies by quarantining alternative narratives within the realm of unthinkable evil. To be falsely portrayed as monstrous forces, the accused into a kind of narrative guerrilla warfare, where he must reclaim ground word by word, interview by interview, truth by clarifying truth. The guest's insistence that his own audience already knows his innocence reveals another truth of the digital age. Reputational repair now occurs not through institutions, but through decentralized tribes who trust the personality over the headline. What once would have been a footnote becomes an identity. When repeated often enough, falsehood becomes destiny, if not actively broken by force of clarification. Reputational myths attach themselves most aggressively to the young, not because they are most dangerous, but because they are the most malleable symbols for institutional fear. The dissident's early year thus resembles not intellectual maturation, but spiritual hazing. One must suffer unjust accusations before being granted the authority to critique the system that produced him. Ironically, the suffering becomes the cornerstone of credibility in anti-establishment movements. For only those whom the establishment has tried to destroy are trusted by those who distrust the establishment. Thus, reputational initiation transforms slander into capital. The more severe the mischaracterization, the more mythic the dissident becomes to his followers, who interpret the hostility as proof of suppressed truth. Awakening and singular exceptions on the ideological conversion, institutional loyalty, and the Israel anomaly. The personal origin story reveals an essential political structure. Ideological transformation rarely begins with intellectual curiosity, but with the shock of discovering a single forbidden topic in a landscape otherwise saturated with debate. The young conservative's awakening occur not when he disagrees with orthodoxy, but when he notices that one orthodoxy, Israel, may not be questioned without punishment. A realization that shatters the illusions of neutral marketplace of ideas. The exception teaches the rule. If all conservative principles can be debated except one, then this space is not guided by principles but by unspoken allegiances. The discovery that one nation is exempt from criticism reveals the hidden architecture of political loyalty networks in America, where support for foreign policy positions is not the product of grassroots conviction, but of institutional catechism. The anomalous Israel clause, embedded alongside tax policy, gun rights, and deregulation, exposes the degree to which ideological packages are not assembled by logic but by patronage. It is not the content of the Israel stance that produce awakening, but the enforced unanimity around it. For the young thinker senses instinctively that where unanimity exists without debate, power must be operating behind the scenes. The traitor of one's youth are not opponents but mentors who refuse to allow inquiry. Nothing radicalizes faster than being punished for a question rather than for an answer. The young conservative exposed to pro-Israel dogma experiences cognitive dissonance not because he opposes the position, but because the position is bundled with unrelated domestic policies, as if inserted by a hidden hand. The taboo signals the presence of a boundary maintained not by argument but by fear, and where fear governs discourse, truth becomes secondary to allegiance. The more fervent mainstream figures insist that the taboo is natural, the more the dissident suspects the presence of a concealed incentive structure, for overreaction always reveals the stakes. The institutional backlash, backlisting, accusations, banishment confirms the dissident's suspicion that the exception is not incidental, but foundational to the conservative ecosystem. Thus, the Israel exception functions as a political initiation rite. Those who obey it are integrated into the establishment. Those who question it are cast into the wilderness where new movement forms. The exception shapes not only foreign policy but identity. The awakening nationalist realizes that America first appears to apply to every issue, except the one where another nation's interests take precedence. The contradiction produces either silence or transformation. Those who choose transformation become dissidents, outsiders, and symbols of generational schism. Institutions fail to understand that suppressing a question amplifies its significance. By forbidding critique of Israel, they elevate it from a policy issue to a metaphysical key in the minds of young dissidents. Awakening the sense is not about Israel itself, but about narrative sovereignty. The young thinker sees that the official story is partly manufactured, and this discovery activates a lifelong suspicion towards all official stories. Thus, the dissident's worldview expands outward from this anomaly, using the Israel taboo as a reference point for understanding how power, narrative, and institutional loyalty operate in every other domain. This is why the awakening cannot be undone. Once one sees the exception, the architecture of the entire house becomes visible. The Trump shock. On the catalytic force of populism, the collapse of old conservatism. The Trump election enters the narrative not as a political event, but as metaphysical rupture. A revelation that the establishment's control over discourse was weaker than it appeared. For the young conservative, Trump becomes the first figure to articulate a worldview not mediated through institutional filters, triggering the recognition that sincerity, however imperfect, is more powerful than ideological pedigree. The rupture exposes the limit of libertarianism, classical conservatism, and institutional republicanism, revealing that these frameworks lack explanatory power of demographic, cultural, and geographical shifts. The nationalist impulse crystallizes not from theory but from contrast. Trump's unfiltered America First rhetoric highlights the degree to which earlier conservatism was constrained by alliances that supersede national interests. The gate, the forbidden exception, and the revenant apprentice Where everyone speaks freely, but one topic cannot be named, there lies the hidden throne. The first punishment for asking the forbidden question is not exile, but metamorphosis. Every ideological order protects its God, not with arguments, but with accusations. On the strange presence of one foreign clause inside an otherwise domestic creed. Every ideological package presented as common sense conservatism, gun rights, low taxes, deregulation, contains within it a single line written in a different script, a foreign clause smuggled into the domestic manifesto. And the dissident's awakening begins the moment he notices that this clause cannot be debated without consequences. It is not the Israel position itself that generates suspicion, but its compulsory nature, the way it travels with unrelated policies like a sacred rider attached to a mundane bill, as if the ideological organism required this graft to maintain internal cohesion. The dissident's first act of rebellion is not opposition but curiosity, asking why a movement that celebrates questioning government power insists that one government must never be questioned. Taboos reveal hierarchy more honestly than mission statements. The issue you may not criticize is the issue that rules you. The exception appears harmless until the young thinker realizes its structural function. It is the keystone that maintains loyalty networks, donor networks, and narrative discipline across the conservative ecosystem. When a taboo is enforced not through argument but through accusation, the dissident senses that the boundary is not ideological but territorial, a protected zone of influence masquerading as moral principle. The moment criticism of Israel becomes equated with racism, sexism, or religious hatred, the dissident recognizes that all identity-shielded categories follow the same script: protect the category, punish the critic, erase the nuance. Protect the category, punish the critic, erase the nuance. Protect the category, punish the critic, erase the nuance. The taboo operates like a firewall in the ideological operating system. Attempt to access this directory and the system crashes, not for lack of evidence, but from fear of losing coherence. Every movement has its inner sanctum. In American conservatism, this sanctum has long been guarded not by priests but by pundits who wield moral stigma as sacrament. The dissident learns that the forbidden topic is powerful not because the arguments are strong, but because it binds together factions that would otherwise fracture. Thus, the anomaly, this one foreign cause, becomes the lens through which the young thinker grasps the entire architecture of ideological control. To notice the exception is to begin the journey. To question it is to be exiled. To survive the exile is to become something ungoverned. Accusation is governance. How labeling replaces debate and how reputations become weapons. The accusation anti-Semite deployed not in response to hatred but to the mere observation of asymmetry marks the moment when dialogue is replaced with discipline. Accusation functions as a governing tool. It is faster than rebuttal, cheaper than refutation, and infinitely scalable across media channels that reward outrage over nuance. The dissident experiences the asymmetry immediately. He is asked to prove innocence against a charge designed to be unfalsifiable, for guilt is determined not by intention but by interpretation. Once assigned the stigma, every neutral statement becomes retroactively incriminating. The network of meaning rearranges itself to sustain the accusation. The public rarely distinguishes between criticism of a state, criticism of a lobby, and criticism of a people. Institutions exploit the confusion to silence foreign policy dissent using the language of civil rights. Accusation is thus not miscommunication but strategy. It positions the critic as a threat to the community rather than a challenger to policy. Because stigma spreads faster than context, the dissident finds himself defined by enemies before allies ever hear his argument. The accusation marks the point at which institutional conservatism ceases to be a marketplace of ideas and becomes a guild enforcing orthodoxy through ritual denunciation. The power of the accusation is not that it is believed, but that it is feared. Public figures rush to distance themselves, thus the stain transfers to them. In this way, the accusation functions as a contagion. Ideological quarantine is imposed, invitations disappear, donors panic, and the dissident becomes socially radioactive. Accusations, once deployed, become self-renewing. Every attempt to clarify is framed as further evidence of guilt, for denial is treated as evasion rather than explanation. Institutions understand that fear of being mislabeled is often enough to enforce compliance, require no evidence, only the threat of isolation. Thus, an accusation becomes the true sovereign of the movement, more powerful than argument, more effective than persuasion, and more instinctively obeyed than any moral principle. The dissident eventually sees that accusation is not a conversation, but a border wall, a warning to others not to approach the same forbidden territory. Blacklisting and the Conservative Inquisition. On CPAC, Daily Wire, the apparatus of punishment and the mechanics of exclusion. Blacklisting is the conservative movement's preferred form of execution, bloodless, deniable, and effective, for it destroys not the person but his access to platforms where persuasion occurs. To be banned from CPAC is to receive a silent decree. You may speak, but not here. You may think, but not that. You may exist, but not in that sphere. The dissident learns that the institutions he once trusted operate more like a federation of tabernacles than a coalition of thinkers. Each protects its orthodoxy by banishing unclean intellectuals. The punishment is not proportional to the offense, but to the threat. A forbidden question endangers the hierarchy more than an immoral act. Blacklisting reveals that power in the movement is not distributed among elected voices, but concentrated among gatekeepers who manage donors, media access, and ideological boundaries. Those who perform the banishment rarely justify it, for justification would require argument. An argument risks legitimizing the dissident's concern. Blacklisting enforces a chill effect. Even sympathizers stay silent, for the penalty of association resembles contagion. All right, that's going to be the end for part 10. Socratic Groyper axioms and the recursive radicalism of Nick Fuentes. We are probably just on page 300. Still reading through it. You can check out my art at zuccagallery.com. You can come into my gallery if you happen to be in Phoenix at 131 Grand. Google the name Abe Zucca. This YouTube channel is very small. I'm still getting ready to start selling these books. I sell them at the gallery, actually. 1301 Grand. I sell a lot of used books there too. So if you do want to get a hand on any of my writings, come into the gallery, 1301 Grand. I haven't figured out how to sell them online yet. I just need more people to want them. All right, I'll see you guys later.